Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 7. The Journalist is Machiavelli. Opening with the following quote. I suppose you can't play every instrument in the orchestra. You can't be a philosopher and a politicker at the same time. That has always been a favorite theory of mine, and I believe 'tis true. From Albert J. Nock. No single incident has dramatized the changing players and personalities of right-wing journalism quite like the much-publicized debate in 1978 between William F. Buckley, Jr., speaking for the affirmative, and Ronald Reagan, speaking for the negative, on ratification of the Carter administration's Panama Canal treaties. The scene at the televised confrontation between Buckley and Reagan at Duke University featured the National Review editor and longtime conservative debater at one table, the two-term California governor and presidential candidate Ronald Reagan at the other. At Buckley's side to help prepare the affirmative argument sat George F. Will, the Washington Post columnist. At Reagan's to bolster the opposition sat Patrick J. Buchanan, the Nixon administration speechwriter and New Right polemicist. Buckley squared off against the most eloquent political spokesman of the American right over an issue that had been proclaimed by New Right activists to be a litmus test of one's political faith. And Buckley, to the dismay of some of his most ardent admirers on the right, had gone into battle against them, needlessly some thought. By then he had in effect already abdicated to a new dynasty of journalists and commentators without his brilliance, who now speak for the united front of the New Right, while Buckley, they have told me, speaks only for himself. The New Right pundits who stepped into the vacuum created by Buckley's increasing absence were not only less astute, they were also more involved in the activities and personalities they were to discuss, and thus too easily compromised. They lacked, that is, a sufficient sense of journalistic calling, and, at their worst, were little more than movement apologists and flacks. They operated on red alert, their publications lacking the toniness of National Review or the Freeman, under the editorial direction of Albert J. Nock in the 40s, tended to be house organs, more concerned with advancing political careers than with independent journalism. The few who have worked their turf without over-concern with the immediate political impact are viewed on the right with suspicion and disgust. George Will of the Washington Post and William Safire of the New York Times have met such a fate. They are not authentic conservatives in the argot of the movement. The New Right's grand strategist. By far the most influential of the New Right theoreticians is Kevin P. Phillips, a Bronx-born voting trend analyst and former congressional aide, who in 1969 wrote The Emerging Republican Majority, the book credited with formulating the Nixon administration's successful Southern strategy. Despite the author's insistence that his book was not and is not a strategy, Phillips provided the initial historical and philosophical underpinnings of the political strategy of the New Right. Pugnacious and argumentative, he may well be the only articulate spokesman for unreconstructed right-wing populism in America. The theme of his strategy was that the national GOP was shifting to a southern and western base, and that such a coalition would triumph over northeastern liberalism in the upcoming elections. That the heyday of the Northeast, which had so long dominated American politics, is dying, and power is moving to Middle America and the Sunbelt states. The great political upheaval of the 1960s is not that of Senator Eugene McCarthy's relatively small group of upper-middle-class and intellectual supporters, but a populist revolt of the American masses who have been elevated by prosperity to middle-class status and conservatism. Their revolt is against the caste policies and taxation of the mandarins of establishment liberalism. The political alliances dating back to the New Deal and the Industrial Revolution, Kevin Phillips announced, are no longer relevant. With an elaborate array of statistical support, he argued that the New Deal coalition of have-nots in the South and West, pitted against the haves of the money and Republican Northeast, has completely reversed itself politically, with the Republican Party now drawing its greatest support in presidential elections from the South and West. Thus, Phillips has become the political theorist-strategist of the New Old West and the anti-elitists of the New Right. A King Features Syndicate columnist and CBS Spectrum radio commentator for several years in the mid-70s, Phillips is a Harvard graduate of lower middle-class origins, whose articles drip with scorn for Eastern elitists and glowing tributes to the wisdom of middle Americans. Once an aide to Republican Congressman Paul Fino of New York, Phillips was a Republican partisan who worked as voting records analyst for Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign. Phillips dedicated his book to this
new majority and its two principal architects, President Richard M. Nixon and Attorney General John M. Mitchell.
He has taken the rough draft of the manuscript to the 68 presidential campaign staff and, as a result, was signed on, eventually becoming special assistant to Nixon campaign manager Mitchell.
Though the book was,
in no sense cleared or censored by the Nixon administration,
galley proofs
were made available to officials of the Republican National Committee.
I knew that I would be in the new GOP administration, and not unreasonably. I had been advised to keep away from policy matters and to make no policy recommendations,
he wrote.
Nor did I feel free to criticize the Republican Party.
During the fall campaign,
elements of my book were distilled into strategy memos.
Phillips was acknowledged to have pointed the way to the Republican sweep of the South. In 1969, Phillips left the White House to become a syndicated columnist. In 75, he published Mediocrity, American Political Parties in the Communication Age. The growth of the so-called knowledge industry has resulted in a
massive shift in the locus of American wealth, culture, and power,
throwing old party loyalties into a tizzy, he wrote.
In New York City, the blue-collar workers and bus drivers of Queens keynote conservative animosity towards the liberal post-industrial, upper-middle class of Midtown Manhattan, a reversal of industrial-era conflict.
Thus, Phillips refined the new Old West's anti-New York City syndrome. He pinpointed the source of infection, not middle-class Queens, but Midtown East Side Manhattan, home of the mass media and
the multi-billion-dollar social engineering industry
that has given rise to a new communications elite, replacing the once conservative business elite. He found that the infection had spread to
many of the nation's chic residential districts, formerly the strongholds of conservative businessmen, but now strongly liberal.
Back Bay, Boston, Scarsdale, New York, Shaker Heights, Ohio, suburban San Francisco. In these urban and suburban centers,
educators, consultants, and media executives
had replaced yesteryear's population of bankers, railroad vice presidents, and merchants.
Liberal educators, government planners, social workers, and network newscasters replaced
yesterday's mill owners and railroad barons as the focal point of popular indigestion. Conservatism, Phillips said,
musters its greatest support in the southern and western areas of historic popular radical proclivities. A middle-class counter-revolution
is brewing on the frontier. The future belongs to political leaders in the tradition of Andrew Jackson,
who represent the raw insurgent forces of the South and West.
These themes became outright political recommendations in Phillips's columns and magazine articles. He proposed a presidential ticket of Ronald Reagan and George Wallace in 1975 in a My Turn guest column for Newsweek. He has called for abolishing the Electoral College as an impediment to new parties and therefore to neo-populist revolt, for restriction on the press's exercise of the First Amendment, and for federal spending programs to benefit the anti-egghead constituency rather than the poor, expressing an enthusiasm for what conservative critics have called
middle-class welfarism.
Perhaps the most stinging indictment of the Kevin Phillips thesis has come from Hamilton Rogers, a pseudonym for a traditionalist conservative who once was, like Phillips, in the Nixon administration. Reviewing Mediocrity in New Guard, the magazine of Young Americans for Freedom, Rogers took issue with Phillips' notion that American history is little more than one great conflict between the masses and a highly educated elite. Phillips' notion that the elite is the enemy, Rogers wrote, reverses traditional concepts of American conservatism.
Whether the leadership is Alexander Hamilton, Mark Hanna, Robert Taft, or Thomas Dewey, they consistently contrast with the political leadership of Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan, Franklin Roosevelt, or Harry Truman. The latter represented the less educated and agricultural and the non-elite.
By the Kevin Phillips logic, the political genealogy of the American right would run instead
from Jefferson, Jackson, Bryan, Roosevelt, and Truman to Wallace and Connolly.
He saw Phillips and the new right taking advantage of a political vacuum created by a change in the Democratic Party, which gave up
the populist anti-Northeast tradition of Jackson and Bryan in favor of an association with an elite.
The political objective,
above all others, is the gaining and holding of power, the exploitation of social alienation, and the sprunning and prudent actions to ameliorate social tensions.
But what is the cost of power for conservatives? Possibly
our purpose for being and our integrity.
The conservative critic wrote. Buckley's House Populist. William A. Rusher, a new right political strategist deeply influenced by Phillips, has been publisher of National Review since 1955 when he was hired by William F. Buckley, Jr. Despite his position, Rusher is something of an outsider in National Review, so populistic are his political attitudes. Rusher has written that Buckley
came to conservatism from the intellectual side, the journalistic side, while I come from the political side. I was in the Young Republicans back in the 50s. Thereafter, I was a conservative in Republican politics and, to a certain extent, a Republican in conservatism and a spokesman for both.
When offered the post at Buckley's magazine, he accepted.
A big decision because I had to leave the career for which I had been trained.
Although the dapper and self-possessed bachelor, member of wine-tasting societies and resident of New York's Murray Hill, moved from the Midwest to the East when he was 9 years old and was educated at Yale, Rusher told me that even when he was a small child,
I had a sense that I was a Midwesterner in New York.
And that feeling has endured through the years. The career he left to enter the world of journalism was the law. Rusher had been an attorney, briefly serving as associate counsel to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee during the Pat McCarran-led investigations into communist infiltration of the Treasury Department. He described himself as a
Senate Red Hunter, a backroom political operator.
He was a key figure in the draft Goldwater movement in '61 and has worked to push the Republican Party rightward during the intervening years. Frustrated by his efforts, he issued his political manifesto, The Making of the New Majority Party, in 1975. Rusher argued that the Republican Party,
being spectacularly unfitted to be the political vector
of a coming conservative revolt, should be unceremoniously dumped. The presence of Easterners associated with Rockefeller dominance, he said, is a plague that prevents the GOP from making common cause with the Wallace constituency in the South, West, and blue-collar urban centers of the Northeast. The nomination of Goldwater in this analysis became something of a triumph.
It demonstrated with mathematical finality that a Republican candidate did not need the support of New York, Massachusetts, or Pennsylvania to win the party's nomination. He didn't even need that mysterious entity called Wall Street. There were new concentrations of financial power in Houston, Los Angeles, and elsewhere that had money too and were prepared to put it where their mouths were.
Social conservatism as a movement of the lower middle class, the Wallaceite constituency, is marked by a profound alienation from upper-class liberalism. The blue-collar workers of the South and Midwest, the urban ethnics of the industrial North, and labor union members all over the country, Rushner contends, are extremely traditional in their attitudes toward quote-unquote social issues. They are patriotic and often militaristic. They believe in the home and the traditional family. They adhere to the work ethic and deplore welfare. They are angered by crime in the streets and resent busing. They may feel threatened by all large institutions, including the labor unions and certainly large corporations that are protected by government subsidies and regulations. The social conservatives can make common cause with economic conservatives who constitute the
long-suffering backbone of the Republican Party.
Scathing anti-elitist epithets spice Rusher's book.
Upper-class wasps and their fellow travelers. A Boston Brahmin, Henry Cabot Lodge.
Facts 5 I'm here just to give a little heads up about this unusual word. The word Brahmin does not refer precisely to two-headed cows, but rather, technically it refers to, like back in ancient Indian societies, the Brahmin caste was a caste of a group of people who were kind of the designated priests of society. Sometimes in English, Brahmin is used as I don't know if I'd call it a slang term, but as a formally informal term to describe someone who is a scholar of sorts. It can sometimes be used pejoratively to describe someone who focuses so much on their education that they don't really understand, common sense or practicality or that sort of thing.
Whose liberalism and ineffable Easternness exceeded, if possible, even that of Nelson Rockefeller. John Kennedy of Massachusetts and Harvard in the international jet set.
Rusher did little to clarify apparent contradictions. He acknowledged that another survey found that most self-described conservatives identify not with right-wing political ideology, but with a conservative lifestyle, personal deportment, social attitudes, moral values, and the
most likely beneficiaries
of this conservatism are political moderates, an admission that would seem to damage his thesis. Indeed, in the 1964 presidential election, a large number of voters supported Lyndon Johnson in the belief that he was the more conservative candidate. These Americans viewed Goldwater as dangerously radical. In his 1975 book, Rusher nevertheless plowed ahead, even giving the political party he wanted to create a name, the Independence Party. He offered the beginnings of a political platform that took the pragmatic position that
many glaring inequities, technically unjustified subsidies, and inherently unsound tax practices,
and probably
unbalanced budgets,
would be political realities for some time to come. It was an admission that led one Republican liberal to tell me with some amusement that Rusher
is proposing for his new party the very same sellouts, trade-offs, and compromises that he finds absolutely unconscionable within the GOP.
Another surprise was Rusher's advocacy of a possible invasion of Middle East oil fields. He maintained in a swaggering Old West style that such an invasion
would reaffirm America's will and cement its alliances while administering a mighty setback to Soviet pretensions and influence all over the world.
Even National Review was unmoved by its publisher's arguments. Its reviewer, Robert D. Novak, wrote,
"A few basic policy suggestions: a strong national defense in foreign policy, less government and less governmental interference, a return to the work ethic, might well attract the broad-based coalition he envisions. But the Rusher platform is chock full to the brim of particularized positions: anti-abortion, pro-school prayer, restrictions on the press, which, in my view, clearly violate the First Amendment, and even a possible expeditionary force to seize Arab oil. The number of conservatives who could agree to all would constitute a cozy group indeed."
It is unlikely that one could muster much support for such a platform, even among the staffers at National Review, and Rusher's influence on the magazine's editorial policy has declined in recent years, according to sources close to the National Review staff. In 1979, the magazine published an editorial critical of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, which prompted a letter to the editor from the publisher taking issue with the editorial. When the letter was published, so was a second editorial, reasserting the original editorial position and disagreeing with Rusher's letter. While Buckley did not acknowledge to me any sense that he and Rusher are going their separate ways on matters of ideology, discussions of the new right and neo-populism are extremely uncomfortable for the magazine's conservative editors, many of whom are in downright disagreement with the publisher. Rusher based his manifesto on a Gallup poll of 74 that reported 38% of the respondents would favor a conservative party if the American party system were to be realigned along ideological lines, while only 26 said they would favor a more liberal party. 36% were undecided. Rusher did not address the fact that a Gallup poll taken 3 years later found that a full 41% of the American people, not counting those who were undecided, would favor the creation of a new center party. The right's new Pegler. Patrick J. Buchanan, the Nixon administration's speechwriter who came to national attention as a result of his cool performance before the Senate Watergate Committee, is a new right tactician like Rusher and Phillips, credited with responsibility for Vice President Spiro Agnew's blistering attack on the national news media, though he has denied it. Buchanan has been closely tied to Nixon since his college days, when he caddied for Eisenhower's vice president at the Burning Tree Country Club. He distinguished himself in Thomistic philosophy at Georgetown University, then became an editorial writer on the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. In 1967, Nixon, gearing up for another shot at the White House, hired Buchanan as a researcher in his New York City law firm. Buchanan went to the White House in 1968 after the Nixon administration collapsed. He became a columnist for the New York Times news service. A colorful, sometimes brutal stylist, the contentious Buchanan appears to have been deeply influenced by the early Westbrook Pegler, before Pegler's anti-Semitism, whose blistering columns he read as a child. Typical of his earthly prose was his comment on the use of action funds to pay for the extortions of Peace Corps volunteers, which he called
shelling out $50,000 a year to execute the unborn children of upper-middle-class bimbos whose idea of bringing the blessings of Western civilization to the third world is to take a tumble in the hay with the local witch doctor.
William Safire has written in Before the Fall that Buchanan, in his opinion,
spoke for Nixon's most elemental moods.
Buchanan's 1975 book, Conservative Votes, Liberal Victories, Why the Right Has Failed, drew on his experience in the pragmatic Nixon White House and attempts to explain why we have a liberal government when the American people are overwhelmingly conservative. Despite conservative inclinations, President Nixon, in office, adhered to a centrist line.
"We are all Keynesians,"
he said, and, in Buchanan's opinion, did more than was necessary to appease the liberals who disliked Nixon almost by instinct, and thus was lost the mandate of 72. Foremost among the reasons for this, Buchanan believes, was the enormous power wielded in American politics by institutions like the federal bureaucracy and federal courts and the national news media.
An unelected oligarchy guided by their own ideology and insulated from the electorate and the common man. The political pressure of millions dependent upon federal checks and federal benefits, and the entrenched and unresponsive power of the media, the bureaucracy, and the courts, taken together prevent implementation of a conservative mandate in American political life. This is why, as polls and surveys show, the nation is moving to the right, the government continues to move to the left.
Against this opposition, it is no wonder that
millions are coming to consider participation in the democratic process through the ballot box like playing poker for matchsticks. An instructive exercise, perhaps, but one that bores readily as it is devoid of meaning.
These angry masses must be mobilized, Buchanan argues, and they must
set as their central political objective
the capture of the White House. Only the presidency
has the discipline and resources to conduct siege warfare against the bureaucracy.
Conservatives must turn that
mighty instrument of government into a siege gun against the welfare state.
Buchanan is a modern Western vigilante on the prowl. It is too late, he concludes, for the politics of
communication, conciliation, compromise, and cooperation.
Promised by a reassuring but inept Gerald Ford, the time has come to
declare war on the Congress, to seek out, not avoid, political conflict with liberals of both parties, to engage in confrontation politics,
Buchanan told me. Buchanan's lack of interest in a coherent program for conservatives calls to mind a comment by the New York Times editorial writer, later U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, William V. Shannon. Since Buchanan
makes clear his disapproval of Nixon's policies on welfare reform, civil rights, wage price controls, unbalanced budgets, and détente,
Shannon said in the New York Times Book Review,
one can conclude that it is the shared resentment of intellectuals and various cultural establishments that bound them together.
This call for confrontation politics has been refined by M. Stanton Evans, a philosophical conservative whose political attitudes are decidedly new right. M. Stanton Evans, who refers to himself as Stan, is a Mississippi native with Southern sympathies who graduated from Yale University, editor of the Indianapolis News until 1975, and national chairman of the American Conservative Union for 6 years. He is a columnist for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate and a CBS Spectrum commentator. Evans came up the conservative ladder rung by rung. His father is Medford Evans, a far-right journalist with a doctoral degree from Yale, whose views are considerably further to the right than his son's. A founder of Young Americans for Freedom, M. Stanton Evans was an activist in Young Republicans and a colleague of William F. Buckley, Jr. at Yale, and one of the brightest young stars on the right-wing horizon. At 25, he joined the staff of the Indianapolis News, and within a matter of months became the nation's youngest editor of a major metropolitan daily. His first book, Revolt on the Campus, 1961, appeared 2 years later. A pale man with thinning, sandy hair, highly intelligent, well-read, with a dry yet wildly imaginative sense of humor, he does not fit the anti-elitist image the new right cherishes, despite his expressed enthusiasm for lowbrow culture. He has a thorough knowledge of public policy. However, the deep involvement in political struggles that cost him much of his credibility as a journalist has reassured his ideological constituency and helped him escape Buckley's fate at new right hands. As a consequence of subordinating his journalism to his political activism, Evans has had an influence increasingly limited to the small circle of Washington political operatives and die-hard right-wing activists in which he moves. Evans's book, The Future of Conservatism, while addressed to Republicans, is a Machiavellian blueprint for new right politics, responding to the popular notion that, in order to win elections, conservative Republicans should strive to appear more positive. Devising alternatives to the liberal programs, Evans writes,
"To date, there is no evidence that the constructive approach has done the party any good, and a great deal of evidence that it has worked the party harm. If constructiveness is pushed much further and becomes established deeply enough in the thinking of enough Republicans, it could easily cancel out the gains the GOP stands to inherit from the suburban revolution, the shift in American population, and the growth of popular resentments against the burgeoning costs of the welfare state."
Convinced that the
Best established fact of political life is that people vote against much more than they vote for.
Evans urges the right to dispense with the concept of constructiveness altogether.
The real job of stirring up the voters and winning elections depends chiefly on the politician's effectiveness in mounting a negative attack against his opposition,
such as moderate and liberal Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats have triumphed the past several decades by conducting
a successful negative campaign against Republicans as heartless ogres, tools of economic royalists, witch hunters, Social Security destroyers, and, of late, nuclear irresponsibles.
Conservatives can win, but
they will have to make their negative presentation superior to that of the Democrats. They must make their version of the bad things that will happen to the country under Democratic rule prevail over the Democrats' version of the bad things that will happen to the country under Republican rule.
His columns are nearly barren of criticism of others on the right, and he is willing to use them to advance the careers of right-wing politicians in a way that subordinates journalism to politics. In 1977, for example, Evans was approached by a representative of Roger J. Stone, the young right-wing activist who was involved in the Dirty Tricks campaign of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, then conducting a successful campaign for the chairmanship of the Young Republican National Federation. The Stone campaign needed someone to write its side of the Dirty Tricks story, and Evans referred vaguely to allegations and
late-blooming charges against the candidate.
Stone's election to the youth post, Evans told me, was important because Stone's opponent, a Reaganite, was in fact a
Rockefeller frontman.
Evans's position as a national chairman of the American Conservative Union, he told me,
impeded my ability to advance professionally.
He accepted the post
because I felt I owed it to what I believe, although I was never quite comfortable given my position as a journalist.
In 1975, when the organization under his leadership undertook an independent effort on behalf of Ronald Reagan's campaign for the Republican presidential nomination, Evans contributed some of his own money in the form of personal loans, never repaid. He worked long hours to advance the efforts and to be
point man,
as he put it, for the Reagan campaign.
It caused real tensions. I would be attending a press conference one day and holding a press conference the next.
His political activism may have cost Evans his position at Indianapolis News. In 1975, he had spoken at the annual Conservative Political Action Conference, urging formation of a new political party to replace the GOP. Indianapolis News publisher Eugene Pulliam responded with an editorial disassociating the newspaper from Evans's proposal. Evans harbors no animosity. The News, he says, was
very good to me and gave me a free hand while I was there.
Shortly thereafter, he left the paper and came to Washington to write his column. In 1978, Evans recorded a radio advertisement on behalf of Alex Smith, the Democratic candidate for the Illinois Senate seat held by Charles Percy, as part of an ad campaign devised by Tony Schwartz, best known for his agency's fierce campaign against Barry Goldwater during the '64 presidential campaign. The Democratic candidate, Evans explained, was a personal friend. He used his syndicated column to promote Seith's political career and signed a fundraising letter for Seith's campaign. Though scrupulous about his personal finances, he accepted no payment from the American Conservative Union or any other political organization with which he associated. He considers himself
an opinion journalist, an advocate, and a conservative spokesman, not a reporter.
He has been critical of the fundraising tactics of some of the less scrupulous new right organizations and has used his influence in right-wing circles to minimize these practices. All the same, he has steadfastly refused to use the weapons at his disposal, his newspaper column or radio broadcast, for instance, to bring these facts to public attention. Evans refrained from writing about fundraising activities that he finds objectionable, he explained, because his longtime identification with the American Conservative Union might make such articles appear to be
internecine bickering.
One conservative activist who shares Evans's objections to the new right fundraising activities told me that if Evans had used his column to expose the fundraisers,
he could have stopped them then and there, but Stan is such a decent and honorable guy that he simply will not use his column to pursue what might look like a vendetta against a personal enemy. And Stan has been feuding with some of these guys for some years now. The other problem, though, is that he's become so personally involved in the developments about which he is writing that it has hurt him too.
Evans obeys an unwritten movement code that
there is no enemy to the right.
I know a great deal about politics and politicians that I do not choose to write about,
Evans told me.
There are many things I know precisely because I've been allowed to attend meetings in which someone who was only a journalist would not be allowed. And, as an ethical matter, I do not believe that I can exploit journalistically what I know as a result of attending these meetings. Pundits and Publicists. Another prominent right-wing journalist, John D. Lofton, Jr., was during the late 70s on the payroll of the American Conservative Union, editing its monthly magazine Battle Line. Once editor of the Republican National Committee's First Monday, Lofton is now a United Features Syndicate columnist, specializing in satiric assaults of the foibles of Republican and Democratic liberals. His favorite foil is the New Left, interviewing Yippie Jerry Rubin at the 1972 DNC. He attached the following headline to the story, which first appeared in First Monday.
McGovern backer no longer thinks sons, daughters should kill parents.
He is a dependable right-wing apologist with few lapses. Shortly after Illinois Congressman Philip Crane was named to succeed Evans as chairman of the American Conservative Union, a column by Lofton extolled the virtues of his new boss with lengthy quotes from Crane's paperback book, The Sum of Good Government, published by Greenhill Books. Crane's book was written by Alan C. Brownfield, a longtime Crane ghostwriter who now distributes his own column and services a number of South African newspapers as a Washington correspondent. Brownfield is not only close to domestic politicians and organizations. In 1977 through 79, he worked for his South African newspapers from a desk in the congressional office of Oklahoma Congressman Mickey Edwards, a staunch new rightist, but also close to foreign governments. In April of 78, for example, he was hired by a representative of the Nicaraguan dictatorship of General Somoza. His assignment, as he told me, was to write a quote-unquote research paper, a task that required him to tour Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama at the expense of the Nicaraguan government. Brownfield is a frequent contributor to Human Events and Conservative Digest and briefly edited the Young Americans for Freedom magazine, New Guard. Then there is Lee Edwards, once a Young Americans for Freedom activist, the first editor of Vigueri's Conservative Digest. When the Justice Department brought suit against the American Chilean Council in 78, it came out that one of the organization's activities had been to plant material favorable to the Pinochet government of Chile with Edwards, then a Washington-based public relations man, who writes and distributes his own newspaper column. Edwards included the information in his newspaper articles. The accomplishment was reported back to the Chileans by the Washington officer of the American Chilean Council, L. Francis Bochny, another product of Young Americans for Freedom, who had shared office space with Edwards back in 75 when Edwards was working closely with representatives of the Taiwan government. The publications. In 1975, fundraiser Richard A. Vigueri founded the slick monthly Conservative Digest after he had tried repeatedly and failed to buy Human Events. Conservative Digest, circulation roughly 130,000, I know because I was its first assistant editor, serving from May to December of 75, was designed to appeal to lower middle-class Americans, the Wallace constituency, in addition to the traditionalist conservatives who already subscribed to Human Events and National Review. There would be no fancy prose or big words, The letters column, which I edited, reflected our success in communicating with the anti-intellectuals. For example, the magazine was praised by one reader because it appealed
not only to the elitist conservatives, but to the lower income, who make up the bulk of America.
2 readers in one issue praised the prose as
easy to read.
The editors did their parts to contribute to this anti-elitist effort. A review of George Nass's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945 cautioned the reader not to be
put off by the word intellectual in the title. Nash has an easy-to-read style.
The book review section later succumbed to the Philistines, replaced by something called the CD Reader Service, a commercial book club venture through which readers can buy books through the Richard A. Viguieri Company. Acutely aware that there were untold birchers among our loyal readers, we pandered to them as best we could, trying to please them by publishing at least one article alluding to the mysterious activities of the Bilderberger conspiracy. We made valiant efforts to appeal to the working man also, including in the first issue, for example, an article written by George Meany on détente. Meany wrote to tell us it was the only article in the magazine with which he could agree. We featured covered stories on George Wallace and placed a heavy emphasis on social issues like busing and gun control. Edwards contributed an essay on the nature of populism, tracing the genealogy of the New Right as represented by Conservative Digest, from Andrew Jackson through William Jennings Bryan to George Wallace. The editorial chores were, without question, a collaborative New Right effort. Edwards once wrote an article which carried Viguieri's byline. It had been dispatched to Alaska to be approved by Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus before it could be printed. On another occasion, I was told to affix my own byline to an article promoting something called the Ad Hoc Committee for a New Majority, headed by Rusher, Phillips, and Viguieri, the purpose of which was to publicize the third-party theory. It had been written, I was informed, by Morton Blackwell, who feared identification might weaken his chance to be a delegate to the 1976 Republican National Convention. The article quoted columnist Jeffrey St. John, who called the third-party concept
a gun pointed at the heads of the two parties.
Conservative Digest was to be
a fresh breath of air cutting through the liberal media.
An advertisement promised in 1975, yet numerous articles were reprinted from such organs of the Eastern liberal establishment as the Washington Post and the New York Times, simply because the editors could not find enough good material elsewhere, discovering too that such publications contained many excellent and unbiased stories relating to the right and its activities. A footnote here reads the following: concluding that Conservative Digest had come to be little more than an adjunct of the Viguieri fundraising operation, functioning to promote rising stars on the right, many of whom were Ravco clients, as well as to discover political developments, I accepted a position with Young Americans for Freedom to edit its publication New Guard and left Conservative Digest. Against the competition, Human Events, an independent publication owned by its editors, has maintained its position of leadership and, benefiting from the growing irrelevance of National Review as a political publication among the right, Human Events has gained in impact. A tabloid-sized weekly, Human Events
enjoys an impact out of all proportion to its circulation,
Newsweek said in 1969. At the height of the Nixon administration, it was considered must-reading at the White House. It is the one conservative publication that has improved since the days when National Review was king, growing from a small newsletter into a full-fledged newspaper of roughly 50,000 subscribers. An
indispensable source of information.
According to Pat Buchanan, it is owned and edited by Alan Reichsid, son of the Marx Brothers' scriptwriter, and Tom Winter, a low-profile, high-influence American Conservative Union activist who functions in the word of one associate,
to moderate the crazies.
This is not an easy task, since much of the readership of Human Events consists of somewhat primitive right-wing activists who must be appeased if the magazine is to remain afloat.
It is a fair criticism to say that we don't go out of our way to anger those people,
Reichsand told me. The editors have nonetheless managed to alienate some of the zanies on the far right. Larry McDonald, the Georgia Democratic congressman who is on the national governing board of the John Birch Society, for example, told me that he thinks the weekly has declined in quality since it came under control of Winter and Reichsend, that it has vacillated in recent years, and is afflicted by a
heavy Republican bias.
The Birchers think Human Events should publicize the evil intent of the
international banking conspiracy,
which forms the linchpin of Bircherite ideology. MacDonald says that Winter is reluctant to tell the truth about the conspiracy because it would mean that he would no longer be invited
to the right cocktail parties.
Outspoken in criticism of the Nixon administration's so-called pragmatism, the Weekly has a leadership role in conservative circles that cannot be underestimated, even as its enemies concede. Winter's personal influence
is absolutely enormous,
Viguieri has said.
Why, Human Events has been a kind of Bible for me the past 20 years, and its editor, Tom Winter, is immensely respected. We've had our differences, that's true, but there's no denying his importance among conservatives. I'm publisher of Conservative Digest, but quite frankly, we don't have nearly the impact that Human Events does. I wish we had.
The difference to which Viguieri refers point quite clearly to what may be Human Events' greatest contribution in recent years. It has steadfastly but cautiously and diplomatically provided reasonable leadership that has undercut the rise of the New Right zealots. Human Events, its conservative side prevailing, has debunked the New Party nonsense. It publicized the tactics of New Right fundraiser Viguieri. It backed Reagan when the New Right extremists were, as noted in Chapter 3, attacking him, and it exposed the record of John Connolly as not conservative. Human Events at its worst is strident and somewhat doctrinaire. Also, its editors could more carefully screen advertisements they publish. One classified ad I answered offered Confederate and KKK memorabilia. It brought me applications for Klan membership. Newsletters have proliferated on the right. Viguieri himself publishes the New Right Report. Edited by Morton Blackwell of the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics until '79, the New Right Report monitors political campaigns and imparts other items of interest to right-wing activists in a journalistic style. In September of '78, the New Right Report predicted that President Carter
now intends to impose national wage and price controls in the next few days.
Quoting a
highly placed source,
it announced that action had been planned to give the president
a quick way to look forceful and dynamic in some area of foreign policy.
Even James J. Kilpatrick, a
faithful reader,
felt obligated to inform the editor that the paper had misspelled the name of both Ramsey Clark and Clarence Kelly in one sentence.
This is probably not a record for a sentence of 25 words,
commented the sage of Scrabble, Virginia.
But it justifies a little marveling all the same. It's not journalism at all,
former Heritage Foundation staffer John Sullivan has commented.
It's a shill.
An entertaining addition to the journalism of the right is the Washington Weekly, which began as a supplement to the Fairfax, Virginia Globe. One of more than 40 newspapers owned by John P. McGough's Panax Corporation. Out of a desire to bring a conservative voice to the nation's capital and thereby provide an ideological alternative to the more liberal Washington Post, in '74 and '75, McGough, owner of numerous weekly and daily papers in Michigan, tried to buy the Washington Star. He presented a bid of $26.5 million, but the bid was rejected, in part because the Star's owners could not determine where McGough was getting the money. In '79, the South African government admitted that in 1974 it transferred $11.5 million from its Defense Department budget to a Swiss bank for purchase of the Washington Star as part of an effort to gain influence abroad. McGough denied press reports that the money had been given to him for this purpose, calling them
utter nonsense.
It was later learned that McGough had part ownership in a ranch in South Africa, and that his Panax Corporation had investments in a printing plant there. McGough, moreover, had considered buying The Citizen, a pro-apartheid newspaper. In 1978, McGough played a key role in efforts by the South African government to control the short-lived New York Trib, started by Leonard Safir, a former aide to Senator James L. Buckley. Safir told me that the Trib was offered secret financial backing from the South African government, with the middleman to be McGough. Safir and McGough met to discuss the deal, but nothing came of it. Safir said because of Safir's unwillingness to surrender control of the newspaper, which he took to be a condition of the investment. Even Richard Mellon Scaife, a member of the Mellon family whose Scaife Foundation has been a contributor to conservative causes, got into the act, Saphir says. The meeting with McGough took place at the suggestion of Scaife, who has subsequently assumed 50% interest in a California newspaper string that includes the Sacramento Union, owned by McGough. McGough is a colorful character himself, having reportedly fired 2 of his Michigan newspaper editors in 1977 when they refused, on the grounds that the stories were unprofessional, to carry stories he had instructed them to publish. Written by a former contributor to the National Enquirer who specialized in stories on the occult, astrology, and Hollywood celebrities, one of the stories contended that President Carter condones sexual promiscuity on the part of his male staffers. The other story quoted a New York psychologist who said the chief executive is grooming his wife Rosalind for vice president in 1984. Later in 1978, according to editor and publisher, McGough was arrested on charges of third-degree assault, disorderly conduct, and reckless endangerment in connection with an incident at Aspen, Colorado Supper Club. The flagship Panax newspaper, the Essenaba in Michigan Daily Press, carried its account of the incident with a 2-column, 36-point headline, "Publisher is facing charges," followed by a 4-column, 48-point headline, "McGough issues statement." According to police, McGough had become angry after a musical group performed a song he described as extolling drugs of all kinds, and tossed a glass at the stage. The glass hit a chandelier, which fell on a girl in the audience, who had to be taken to a hospital for 5 stitches. McGough pleaded guilty to the reckless endangerment charge and was allowed to serve a sentence program of volunteer work at a drug rehab program. That behind him, McGough finally landed a Washington outlet by creating his own. Originally called Politics and Religious News, the supplement to the Fairfax, Virginia Globe, the suburban Washington newspaper was edited by the Reverend Lester Kisselving, an Episcopal priest.
The supplement often featured a sex scandal story and other sensational items, occasionally reflecting the alleged loose morals of religious leaders.
One former Globe reporter told me.
It was a real embarrassment to the rest of us.
McGough and Kinsolving transformed the supplement into the tabloid-sized Washington Weekly in '78 with a rip-roaring collection of columns by Buchanan and other polemicists, and with original articles by Kinsolving attempting to demonstrate the liberal bias of the Washington Post and Star. McGough no longer owns the tabloid, having sold it in '79 to Kinsolving, a boyhood friend who writes a political column for the McNaught Syndicate and reports for radio station WAVA in Arlington, Virginia. In 1977, Kinsolving was voted out of the State Department Correspondents Association. His press credentials allowing access to the Congressional Press Gallery were revoked when it was learned that he had accepted payments from the South African government. According to Kinsolving, he had agreed to attend meetings of the stockholder of corporations under fire for their activities in South Africa, to respond to criticism of their government, for which he was paid $2,500. Kinsolving has compared the payments to
lecture fees.
Despite these and other troubles, White House Press Secretary Jody Powell once threw a rubber chicken at Kinsolving during a news briefing. The weekly continues to be distributed widely on Capitol Hill, though with little influence. It remains, for the most part, a collection of reprinted syndicated columnists, and more frequently, voluminous articles by John Lofton, the weekly's new managing editor, who took on the task along with the job of editing the American Conservative Union's battle line. One legislative aide of a conservative Republican congressman told me,
"There's no question that the Washington Post has some very serious blind spots, so I think a conservative paper in Washington would be very healthy. All the same, I don't think the Washington Weekly is it. It's biased and sensational and altogether kind of shoddy. A lot of people seem to read it, but they don't take it seriously."
Washington Weekly cannot begin to compete with Accuracy in Media, or AIM, when it comes to exposing the liberal prejudices of the press. Established in 1969, AIM intends
to provide a watchdog of the news media by promoting accuracy and fairness in reporting on critical issues facing America.
AIM does an effective job of this despite its own right-of-center bias. The creation of the tenacious Reed Irvine, a former Fulbright scholar and Federal Reserve Board economist, AIM keeps close watch on the national news media, publishing its findings in Irvine's syndicated column distributed by AIM itself, and a bi-monthly newsletter, AIM Report. Not content, as Evans has written, to
document and complain,
Irvine and his cohorts have developed a modus operandi that can be maddening to business. They have purchased shares of stock in those major media outlets that are public corporations and have attended stockholders' meetings to badger, among others, Katharine Graham of the Washington Post. In May of '78, for example, Irvine completed a study of the Post's lack of coverage of the atrocities being carried out by the new Cambodian regime, despite heavy coverage of human rights violations in Chile. He confronted Mrs. Graham with the results at a stockholders' meeting. When he received an explanation that seemed to him feeble at best, he proceeded to show that the Post's Havana correspondent had once been employed by the Castro government. He demanded to know what procedures the Post takes to ensure the newspaper is not being infiltrated by the Soviet KGB. The Post, he learned, has no system whatever for screening applicants politically, though Graham agreed that the newspaper would be a prime target for KGB infiltration. After a series of skirmishes with Irvine, Post editor Ben Bradley finally fired off a testy letter denouncing AIM's resident pest as a
miserable, carping, retromingent vigilante.
No single figure in American journalism has more convincingly proved his ability to make liberals reel aghast than William Loeb, publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, New Hampshire's only statewide daily. The septuagenarian Loeb carries great influence, especially every 4 years when presidential hopefuls gear up for the nation's first primary election. Loeb may be a rock-ribbed rightist, but it is his journalistic style rather than his politics that rile many liberals most, driving them to periodic denunciations of the Union leader. The son of an aide to Teddy Roosevelt, Loeb is married to the Scripps Howard heiress and lives in gentlemanly splendor 30 miles north of Boston, overlooking the sea. In print, he's a Neanderthal, hammering out front-page editorials that have denounced politicians left and right as
Jerry the Jerk, Gerald Ford. A skunk's skunk, Eugene McCarthy. A stinking hypocrite, Dwight Eisenhower. And the California Flake, Jerry Brown.
The reaction against this name-calling often leads Loeb's liberal critics to overestimate his influence. In 1970, for example, Loeb's choice for governor, Democrat Roger Crowley, was defeated. Loeb is, in truth, more politically moderate than is suspected. A soft-spoken, gentle, and courteous man in person, he is opposed to right-to-work laws and generally pro-labor, favoring 100% inheritance taxes the Union leader will pass into the hands of its employees upon Loeb's death. And he has, he explained to me, reservations to the rise of the prominence of Richard Viguerie and the zealous elements of the New Right. One news service reporter, reviewing Kevin Cash's biography of Loeb in Young Americans for Freedom's New Guard, explained the New Hampshire Reaganite's fearsome reputation like this.
He is a conservative, and the establishment media likes to conjure up right-wing threats for their liberal heroes to slay.
His weakness for the colorful epithet may, however, be responsible for a reputation for political warfare. When he called Nelson Rockefeller a
wife swapper
in 1964, the thrice-married Loeb explained to a reporter,
I make no claim to excessive virtue, but I had to get Rockefeller out of the picture. It was important that Goldwater win.
Busting up big media. While the new right pundits and publicists fire away at their liberal enemies, the hostility of the new rightists to what they consider the liberal media continues unabated at almost the pitch it reached when Spiro Agnew lashed out at the press during the Vietnam War, despite evidence of growing fairness to the conservative, if not new right, viewpoint in the major newspapers, magazines, and on television. The rise to prominence of a number of conservatives, though decidedly not new right, commentators, Sapphire and Will, for example, and the continued visibility of William F. Buckley Jr. and James J. Kilpatrick, make it increasingly difficult to argue that the conservative position is not amply and ably represented. That these pundits are not
authentic conservatives, but creatures of the liberal media,
in new right jargon, only intensifies the anger of new rightists who feel shut out from the major media. As this hostility grows, so does the impatience of the new right pundits and politicians who, along with their new hostility towards big business, have begun to view the national news media as a monopoly badly in need of government regulation, if only in the form of trust-busting. Kevin Phillips has argued in the pages of Human Events that the First Amendment is
obsolescent, since it cannot cope with big media power,
a situation that
invites, even obliges the government to move in and, in the name, of course, of the free press, correct the situation.
If the First Amendment cannot stop the adversary culture, Phillips writes,
we need a new socio-prudential approach that can solve the problem before the government throws the baby of a free press out with the bathwater of liberal establishment bunk.
Such talk must surely cause distress to conservatives committed to the conservation of civil liberties, suggesting an area in which government regulation of the media could accomplish precisely what conservatives have warned occurs when government extends its tentacles to regulate private activity. Freedom is diminished. And in the case of the press, it would occur where freedom is crucial to the survival of the society. Failure of the new right journalists to understand this is, in itself, distressing.